Welcome to the Faith and Arts Project, hosted by the University of North Carolina, Asheville and Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center. I'm Rick Chess of UNC Asheville. This project offers us an opportunity to explore the role of arts in spiritual practice and religious life, and the role of spiritual practice and religious life in the arts. In the aftermath of the postponement of the Faith and Arts Institute, originally scheduled for May 2020, we've been developing digital programming featuring artists and scholars whose work may offer us fresh ways of thinking about the connections at this moment between religion, spirituality, and the arts. We began in May with Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center Instagram takeover. Our work continues with the Faith and Arts Research Project, a series of conversations with artists and scholars that will continue into the fall. The project will culminate in fall 2021 with the rescheduled Faith and Arts Institute. You can learn more about the project on the Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center and UNC Asheville websites. Again, welcome. Now, on to the conversation with Norman Fischer, prolific poet, writer, Zen Buddhist priest, founder of the Everyday Zen Foundation, as well as, along with his late beloved friend, Rabbi Alan Liu, may his memory be for a blessing, Makor Or, a Jewish meditation center. Norman will be in conversation with Molly Silverstein, poet, graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, and former Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center staff member, and with me. So welcome, Molly and Norman.
Thank you. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Should be fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Norman. I'm so thrilled to be here with you and Rick today and excited to ask you a lot of questions. I think I would love to start off with kind of a spiritual autobiography, if you're willing to share that with us. Would love to learn more about the spiritual background of your childhood and any ways that that might inform your practice today, any formative moments that stand out to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, let's see what I can remember. Uh, so I grew up in my grandmother's house. My parents lived with my grandmother, and we all lived together. My brother and I, and all of them. My grandfather uh, was sick. He had, I don't even know what he had, because I grew up in the 19th century almost, because my grandparents were born in the 19th century, and we actually lived in a house that was a 19th century house over the tailor shop in a town where my grandparents had a tailor shop. So it was a very weird and odd uh, uh, house. And my grandfather was sick. And so the reason I mentioned the 19th century is because it was the era when you didn't talk about people being sick. And the your elders were objects of great respect. So my grandfather was the head of the household, but never appeared hardly from his room. He was very ill, and we were all supposed to be, the children were always supposed to be quiet. So I was very aware of illness and of something going on in the world that was difficult and not to be mentioned. This was my early experience. And then my grandfather died when I was about 7. And when that happened, there was no conversation about it. The children were whisked away, this sort of thing. So I really was quite formed by a relationship to death. And in my youth, and I didn't know how to name it or what it was, but I just knew there was some secret thing going on that was not good, that was very difficult and not to be mentioned. So death became actually an obsession with me from the time that I was very, very young, in this very undefined way. And since I think that all spirituality comes from the fact that we die. If people didn't die, I don't think we would be bothering about spirituality. We wouldn't have time for it. But since we die, and this is a problem for us, and something we cannot possibly understand or cope with, we need all these strategies to deal with it. So that's where all the spirituality comes from, I think. So I really had this from very early on. And then when I was young, so our family was a very observant Jewish family. When I say very, maybe I shouldn't use the word very, but observant. In other words, we kept kosher. We went to synagogue. We celebrated all the holidays. My father and mother were not learned and not educated people in Judaism or in secular education, but they were faithful. And our whole world, social world, centered around the Jewish community. Even though we didn't live in a Jewish area or a Jewish neighborhood, Jews were a small minority in our area. But they kind of hung together, and that was the social life, and the synagogue was the life. And I always, just took that for granted, and never rebelled against it or had any problem with it or anything. And then when I was about to be bar mitzvah, the community hired a young rabbi from New York who was having his first congregation. And he was a wonderful rabbi, and he was very smart, he was, an Orthodox rabbi. Our community was nominally conservative, meaning not the farthest to the right in terms of observance. But most of the members were European born and were very religious anyway. But this rabbi, while being fully observant, had very up-to-date viewpoints and read lots of philosophy and literature. And it was funny, nobody in the whole place, was interested in anything that he was interested in. People just wanted to do their duty in the synagogue and never mind about thinking about anything. So he was a little frustrated, that there was nobody to talk to. So he talked to me. It was kind of great because I had this ongoing class with my rabbi, which was ostensibly preparation for bar mitzvah, but it actually went way beyond that. And we read and studied all kinds of things, including Jewish things. And of course, I did prepare extensively for my bar mitzvah. But it gave me like a really powerfully beautiful sense of Judaism and the religious life as not being something, closed down, but something expansive and wonderful. So I was very religious, actually, because of his influence as a young boy. I was like a child prodigy. I would lead the services in the synagogue every single day. I went every day, and loved to daven and study and all that. And his leaving the congregation, because he was, he didn't want to be there. It was just the only job he could get in the beginning. But as soon as he could get a job and return to New York, where there was a very developed Jewish world, he did. So he was probably only in our community for, I don't know, less than 5 years. But it happened to be the most important 5 years for me. And when he left, it coincided with my being an adolescent. And of course, you go through a lot of changes then. You get interested in girls. Sports becomes really important. So on a dime, it seemed like as soon as he left, my whole life changed. And I stopped going to synagogue every day and doing all the religious things that I did. And the religious life all of a sudden stopped being at the center of my identity and my activity. And now I was like an average, ordinary American high school kid. And so I was sort of somehow conscious of the fact that I had let go of something that was very intimate. And I was now entering into, the world and social life. Somehow or other, I knew that. And I knew that sometime or other, I would get back to what I had abandoned without necessarily feeling like I was abandoning it, but just moving on, to other things that were more compelling. And eventually, I think when I went to college, I felt like I was returning. But then it was Vietnam and it was politics. And I was subject to the draft. And so the politics was very personal and crucial. So then I really got involved in the 60s political movements. I was very, very political, very active, a leader in our college. We had a occupation of the administration building, like a lot of colleges did in the spring of 1968. And I was a leader in that and very involved in that. But then after that came to a crescendo, there was a time there where there was a lot of violence. A lot of the protests were dangerous. I got at one point really whacked by the police and arrested. And so I felt like that had come to an end point. And so this happened in Iowa City when I had left my undergraduate school and was in the writer's workshop. And so at the time that I graduated from Iowa City and also had come to a crescendo with my political life, I decided this was the time to return to whatever it was that I had left off long ago. So that's when I began. I actually moved to California, not knowing anybody, no job, no reason to be there other than it was California and it was 1970. And I went and I lived in the woods by myself and I learned how to do Zazen. And I just, lived and wrote and did odd jobs for a few months to just get enough money to live like a hermit, on almost nothing. My mother would send me $5 or $10, in the mail, in a bill inside a letter, and I would live on that almost, for a while. And eventually I went back to school to get a master's degree in religion because I had established by then a Zen practice. And then I moved back to the Bay Area and began practicing with the San Francisco Zen Center. And then I just, I did not see myself as a religious person or a religious leader. I just saw myself as someone who had a problem being a human being. And I needed to deal with that. And so I was willing to do anything that it took to deal with that. And that's, so I ended up, even though I never wanted to do it, I ended up becoming ordained as a Zen priest and spending 25 years or so in full-time Zen practice, even to the point of becoming a co-abbot of the temple. Even though, like I say, I just wanted to be a poet and figure out how to live without going crazy. And so it all sort of unfolded in a surprising way. To this day, I don't feel like I decided to do any of the things that I did. I just was trying to keep my head above water. And that's what happened,
Thanks for that incredibly, rich, response. You mentioned toward the end, and you kind of got started by talking about, well, you had a problem, the problem of being human. And in that great essay that you wrote, Light, Silence, Word, which is published in Radical Poetics and Secular Jewish Culture, you wrote, the process of becoming human always involves the practice of language. And so you talked about, you wanted to be a poet, you were a poet or whatever. And, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is the practice of language? And, how does the practice of language help you address that problem of being human?
Well, I remember when I was a kid, and I still feel this way now, the sense that being alive in the world is a truly awesome procedure. I mean, awesome in the sense that it's staggering. You don't know how to relate to it. It's overwhelming in some way. It's a good thing that human beings are so good at denial and sort of filtering our experience. Because if we were open to our experience as human beings, it would be just too much for any of us, right? So, which I think accounts for the tone of voice in the 5 books of Moses. That's an aside. Anyway, anyway, so the thing is, you have no choice but to somehow respond to that. In other words, you have to, almost like out of self-defense or out of just, there's no other thing to do but find a way to respond to it. And with our language, we're always responding to it. I mean, when we reach out, and this is the thought of Buber and Levinas, when we reach out to one another, just an ordinary human connection, right? Talking to each other like we're doing now, trying to communicate and be understood by the other person, that's a kind of response to the awesomeness of being alive. How could there be another person, that doesn't know us, right? How's that possible even? And how do we get to be known by that person? So it's a very profound thing. And we do it with language. And even when there isn't another person there, there's our own descriptions of what we're seeing. I mean, in a way, what is, we don't even know. I'm kind of obsessed with trees, and I look at trees. Well, I don't see a tree unless I say tree. In my mind, I have the idea of a tree, and all of my perceptions involve a subvocal level of language. So language in its many forms, symbolic systems, whether they're literally words, words are so beautiful because we all use them, every human being. We don't need to be an artist, right, to be a language user and a language maker. But visual languages, right, or sound languages, or movement languages, all the arts are different forms of language in some way, right? They're all an effort to respond. Here's this world, here's my response to it in this moment. Here's my way of coping and expressing so much. I'm using negative language, awesome, coping, troubling, but there's also the joy, right, of here I am, I don't have to be here, and then we also know, and I'm not here long, and here's the joy of being in this moment, responding to all this. So I think we're all doing this. I mean, every human being, I think, does this. I think in a way the arts have become a special category. Spirituality has become a special category, but I don't think any of these special categories are necessary, because everybody's doing this. Everybody who's talking to another person, who's feeling a feeling and naming a feeling, or avoiding a feeling, avoiding naming a feeling, is doing that in one way or another. And usually our attempts at it are very unsuccessful and painful. So we try to help each other, and we have systems called religions or arts or human relationships that are supposed to help us with this. We need help, but to me that's being human. So that's why the category is that's why I always feel funny about spirituality. There's no such thing, in a way. The arts, there's no such thing. There's just us, any one of us, finding our way to cope with, relate to, express ourselves in the situation in which we find ourselves.
Yeah, just drawing on that beautiful meditation, I have here a quote that you've written: art practice is an antidote to religious doctrine and dogma. And I wonder, I wonder what you would say about that, sort of in the context of these categories, art and religion and spirituality, maybe not being separate at all, or not being necessary in some way. How can art practice or poetic practice provide an antidote to what can be the dogmatic or doctrinal side of religions, or can it provide an antidote to that, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, that certainly me, you know, it was true for me. I don't know, it might be different for different people. But when you said that, I thought to myself, you know, well, like it crossed my mind when I studied American literature, you know, a long time ago in college. There was some sort of a anthology, and it started with I think Jonathan Edwards' sermons. You know, because a sermon, right, is a work of art, right? And we don't categorize sermons as literature, right? But in fact, sermons are literature. That's a form of literature. So people who are working in the field of religion are also artists, you know, performing their works, and clergy people are performers, right, for better and worse. Right? Um, but yes, I mean, religion, because of the way it's set up and the way we've come to understand it, uh, does in fact tend often, and I certainly don't think it's meant to be this way, but tend often to promote a kind of narrow-mindedness. Like, these are the things that we know we're all supposed to believe are true. And should you have any thought or feeling outside the framework of these things, you better forget it or pretend it's not there. And so an unfortunate sort of byproduct of the development of our native spirituality. And so in my, I'm not that subject to that sort of thing anyway, but certainly for me, having a life in poetry, which I've always had, poetry's been, you know, a daily occupation of mine and something I think about and participate in, and you know, have lots of long-time friendships in poetry. Having that as an alternative perspective has helped me to not fall prey as much as I otherwise would have to the dogmatism of religion. But you know, these days it actually goes in both directions, because nowadays, you know, the arts have their dogmas, right? So, so actually, there are just as much, you know, there are fundamentalisms, you know, in the arts now. I mean, I don't think there used to be, or maybe we didn't notice them as much. Now they really are. It's pretty clear. And so I would say that for an artist, it might be good. And I know many artists for whom this is really actually the case. It might be good to have a practice like meditation or some form of open practice that would help free up an artist from the sort of dogmas in which the arts now take place. There are certain things it's not okay to think or feel if you're an artist, right? And so to prevent yourself from being closed off in the arts, I think it might help you to do some spiritual practice, as a lot of artists do. I mean, because for one thing, the arts are very competitive now, and the arts have become a business. You know, I know, like, I have a son who got his MFA at Columbia, and so much of what he learned there was, you know, basically like branding and marketing, because that's more important than the art you make. If you have to know how to sell and get noticed, right? And if you don't know how to do that, what's the point of making the art? So anyways, the curriculum seems to say. So it goes both ways now.
Thanks, Norman. So you talk about, you know, you've been writing poetry, you write poetry every day, you publish lots of books, amazing books. Um, uh, what are you working on now? Like, you know, how does a new project, a new poem start to come to you? You know, what happens in your daily practice? And can you share with us a poem? I don't know if you have something that you're working on now that you have available to share, or something from a recent book. Uh, but maybe let's talk about that a little bit, especially, you know, your life as a poet, and 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 working in a context now where there is this dogma and sort of fundamentalist attitudes about, you know, what art should be, how it should be made, et cetera, and how you continue to cultivate that kind of expansiveness and experience and express. And act out of and write out of that expansiveness in your own work?
Mm-hmm. Well, for one thing, these days I think of myself as an amateur poet in the sense that, like, when I was young, it wasn't the case, but now it is the case that there's a whole class of professional poets, literally. I guess you're one, right? Poets, poets who that's their job. They work in the academy and they profess poetry and they teach it, and that's their livelihood. Being a poet is their livelihood, and so they have to publish books because it's part of their job, and they get time off. They get sabbaticals and stuff like that to produce their books of poetry. So they're literally professional poets. And I'm not a professional poet. You know, I don't. I mean, I don't get paid to be a poet. It's not my job to be a poet. I do it. To be an amateur means literally, you do it out of love only. And so the reason I say that is because what that means is that I am not as connected to professional networks of poetry as many other poets are nowadays. In fact, the best poets, really and truly, in the country are in the academy. I mean, not all the great poets, but most of the best poets are in the academy one way or the other. I mean, Ginsberg ended up in the academy. You know, Gary Snyder was in the academy. Everybody, because how else do you earn a living? You have to earn a living. So, but what it's meant for me is that I'm not as connected to those professional networks. And so in a way, just because I'm not so connected, I'm freer. Now, the thing is that it doesn't do to be unconnected, because I think poetry is communal, and it does operate on communities. And I think, you know, there is a concept, I suppose, of a lone romantic poet, you know, who doesn't have anybody that he or she communicates with, but, you know, only writes out of the depth of their own soul, you know. But that seems like really unrealistic and probably never existed, because every such poet was in touch with other such poets one way or the other. Poetry is like that. And I really value I have a number of really, really important friendships in poetry that are very important to me. People who read my work and I read their work, and we communicate, and, you know, there's magazines. So I'm part of the world of poetry, but in almost a very personal way rather than in a professional way. And that frees me up, and that makes it so that I, to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, can just follow my nose and not follow the fashions and the trends. Not that I'm complaining about fashions and trends. I mean, fashions and trends are brilliant, right? They're a collective expression of where the culture is at a particular moment. So God bless them. But, you know, I'm not that connected to all that. Just in my view, I'm connected just enough, but not too much. So everybody has to find their own proper relationship to the community. So for me, I'm actually fairly free to kind of like follow my nose. And what I'm doing is I'm always kind of, I keep journals, of course, and in the journals, I'm sort of writing and following wherever the words take me. And, you know, so I'm always writing short poems, little poems, this, that, the other thing, most of them not so good necessarily. And I'm always thinking, waiting for something to happen that I'm not making happen, but that happens somehow through the process of my noodling along. And then when something happens and I recognize something's happening here, then I know enough to grab hold of it and explore it and let it take me somewhere. So for me, I guess in some way, I guess maybe this is true of every poet, but in some way I'm an experimental poet in the sense that I get into a mode. So I'm not writing poems per se, I'm writing series of poems in a mode. And the mode might be a subject matter, it might be a strategy, a particular strategy, it might be something about language or about poetic form. Sorry. But one way or another, I'm waiting for that thing to appear and for me to recognize it. and then let it take me somewhere. So I'll give you an example, and I'll read something. This is just out book, so I'm kind of excited about it. It just came out. It's called Nature, and I'm very proud of it because here you can see, I guess you can see this, the front cover and the back cover, which are photographs that I took around my house on the day that the sun never rose, so to speak, in the Bay Area, because there were so many fires and so much smoke in the air that this is midday light in the Bay Area. So I don't know how I got into this, but I somehow or other was rewriting Emerson's essay, Nature. And that's what this is. This is me rewriting line by line Emerson's Nature, because when Emerson wrote his essay on nature, he obviously, the concept that human beings could alter nature so that nature would behave not the way it eternally, in his mind, behaved. Because what could be more eternal than the climate and the spring, summer, winter, fall, and the way the earth went? Human beings could come and go, but the earth was eternal. He did not foresee that human beings could actually behave in such a way that it would influence the earth and the earth's patterns. So I rewrote his essay with the consciousness of now, and it was a lot of fun, and it came out to be a really fun text. So I'll read you a little piece of this. It's in prose, following his essay. Nature. Facts can be known and nothing abides. It's a process of factual disintegration, a divine dream. Maybe we'll wake up. Idealism must be so. It provides its own proof, for mind's boundless container expresses the question's limits. Yet the spirit sinks. It wants more. I seem to need God in me to be myself. Otherwise, there's just a swirl of thoughts, worries, perceptions, needs, desires, a labyrinth with a devouring monster at every turn and no way out. I must insist on the comfort of something here or there or somewhere beyond my mind. I need the affection. I must be attended. Who will read my words? Hear my sobs? Bear witness to my ontic needs? Nature is only human, as far as I'm concerned. She is me, I am her. Yet all good thinking leads me away from this comforting feeling. Soul over here, me. World over there, you. This is matter. But when we ask, where does matter come from? Where does it go? Thoughts flood the mind. We know that time collapses, location erodes, and what seems ungraspable illuminates the heart. Matter comes from nowhere, goes nowhere. How could it? The heart, the soul swoons with this light-filled certainty that behind, within, and throughout nature, spirit sweeps, hidden and completely revealed. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. And that's an example of something. So it took me a long time, right, to go through. And I was very happy when I'm writing a project on a project or something like that. I'm always very happy, and my mind is partly involved in it. And then when I get to it, I'm very happy, and it goes on, it takes over me, and it has its own way of writing itself. And then when I'm in between projects like that, I'm always noodling and writing individual poems. But I'm always a little feeling like, when is the other shoe going to drop? Is it ever going to drop? Maybe it never will, but when will it? So right now, I'm writing a series of poems, every one of which is called Poem, capital Poem, with a in parentheses a little subject, and they're connected to each other, so it's a long series. And then I'm just about to finish another series called Window. It struck me at the beginning of the pandemic that I would just sit at the window, various windows, where I have two different studies where I write, out the window and look out the window and simply describe what I see there. And so it's a series of poems called Window, which is just the same stuff, that I'm seeing every single day out the window, described every day for that day. That's been fun, but that's a project that I'm still writing it. I'm writing it in a notebook. I haven't typed it and evaluated it, so you never know whether all my projects so far have succeeded, quote unquote, in the sense that I brought them to completion. They got published, with the exception of one or two, maybe. So you never know whether a project will be worthwhile or whether it will just collapse of its own weight when you're done. So I don't know about that one, but that's what I'm doing now.
This is great. Thank you so much for reading from nature. I can't wait. I knew you had published that book. I just haven't gotten a copy of it yet, which I will do as soon as we finish this conversation. And I love the other two projects you're talking about, especially the Window project. Molly, I'll turn it back to you in just 1 second. It just makes me think, when you talk about, well, I'll sit at the window and describe what I see outside the window, just describe. Years ago, when I was in the 70s, when I was living with Jeff Roth, a mutual friend of ours, in Sfat in Israel, one Shabbat afternoon, I was wandering in the cemetery there where all the great Jewish mystics, from the 16th century were buried. I didn't know, according to Orthodoxy, you're not supposed to be in a cemetery on Shabbat. It was super peaceful. And I went and I sat down on the crypt of Isaac Luria's, grave. And I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that either. But, and I was sitting there and I started to have this experience, almost like an out of body experience, feeling like the soul of Luria was coming up through me. And I took out my little notebook because I wanted to start writing. And I felt like this was mysterious and weird, but I heard this voice say to me, just describe whatever I show you. And then and I would feel my head like be tilted in a certain direction, and I'd write something down what I described, and then I'd feel my head turn in another direction, and I'd write down just describing, not even commenting on it. So, when you talk about, sitting out the window, just describing what you see, for me, that was like a little of experience of a moment of like, okay, something is happening. I don't understand it, but I'm just going to follow the instructions, and I'm just going to trust. I'm just going to describe what I'm shown moment by moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's beautiful, and it's. I've had that experience a couple of times where people who are dead are talking to me and speaking through me. But when you said that, I thought, yeah, and it's always like that. Anytime you see anything, it's like that. Except that once in a while, you realize it in a moment like that when it seems different, but actually it's always like that.
I wanted to ask you about the relationship between Zen practice and poetic practice in your life. If there is a relationship, how you see the two related. Because when you were speaking about your Window series, I just I thought of a meditation practice, like the idea of doing the same thing every day, perhaps sitting in the same place. And yeah, I was curious if that was informed at all by your relationship with Zen. And I wanted to ask you, as a sort of tacked on question to follow up, when you're writing a series like that, how do you know when you're done? Is there a feeling, or yeah, do you finish the notebook?
Exactly. That question is very easy. I know when I'm done when I come to the last page of the notebook. So a number of my projects have been like that. I've had a notebook only for that project, and the project was done when there were no more pages in the notebook. Yes, exactly. And about Zen practice, you know, I was writing before I was practicing Zen. I was writing since a child, and but when I was in college, and I began to, become self-conscious about writing and serious about it, and was involved with the college literary magazine, and I had one of the professors was a writer, and there were other students who were writing. We were writing for each other, reading our work, and so on and so on. And then I guess my writing was decent enough so that I was admitted to the writers' workshop at the University of Iowa. But I myself didn't feel that confident in my own writing. I felt like I was still trying to figure it out. And I was still trying to figure it out throughout the time that I was in Iowa. And I couldn't figure it out because I kept getting in my own way. I think, ego is a funny creature, that we all live with. And it's very troublesome. And, some people figure out how to work it so that it works for them. And I could never quite figure it out. And so it kept getting in the way of my writing. It was very difficult. I was having a hard time. And I think that practicing Zen gave me a way of getting out of my own way. So that in writing now, I don't get in my own way. I really let the writing lead, and I don't let my own egotistical needs or predilections get in the way too much. And so that really helped me. I don't know that I could have actually continued to write with any degree of happiness or success without Zen practice, without Zazen practice specifically. And I don't really know why there's a whole romantic trope about, how hard it is to be a writer, and the struggle and the suffering and all of that. And to me, it's not worth it. Like, why would anybody do it if it was no fun and such a struggle? Not that everything is easy about it, but if it weren't fun and satisfying, and solving, something deep in the soul in a beautiful way, why would you do it? So for me, since I began Zen practice, it changed my approach to writing in such a way that I could really enjoy it and revel in it rather than struggle with it and suffer with it, because it gave me a way of getting out of my own way.
So maybe just one or two more questions, and there might be time also if you have another little piece if you want to read again. This is a question. I mean, you write a lot of prose and a lot of poetry, and I just wonder. Do you experience language differently when you're doing a prose project, and when you're doing a poem? Language have a different function, a different sense of audience. I know that in the Psalms book, in Opening to You, the Zen-inspired, translations of Psalms, it was an incredible book. I keep it like right where I sit, and I read those Psalms many mornings, before I do my own, practice. But you talked about like not being sure, like you're addressing some being, something, and that in fact, you said that the being is like even inside you or with you, in you, whatever, while you're dressing it. So, I wonder, do you feel that same thing when you're writing, the world could be otherwise, or your new book, When I greet you, I bow. Did I get the title of that one right?
Yeah,
Yeah, which I also look forward to reading. So I'm just, you know, curious about your experience in working with language in these different genres, you know, poems and prose.
that's a great question. Yeah, I should say it's when you greet me, I bow. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it is. There are differences. There are different modes. I mean, on the one hand, language is language, and so the process of writing is different from speaking. Right? We're speaking now. We're using language, but you, as a listener, are very present in my language now. When I'm writing, you're not there. So there's this writing is always has a more of a sense of inwardness to it, even though you know in writing maybe there's an audience that is addressed. Still, they're not physically present. They're being, even on the computer, you know, your being you is part of my language now. So that's a big difference, and that's true whether it's poetry or prose or whatever it is. Written language, which was a fairly new thing in human civilization, creates a new kind of subjectivity and a new possibility for subjectivity. So that's the same no matter what. But yes, within that sameness, there's a lot of differences because um, when I'm writing a Dharma talk, let's say, which is a lot, I've written a lot of Dharma talks, you know, huge numbers of pages of Dharma talks. Then I know who I'm talking to, and I'm really talking to them. And in that sense, like now, I don't. It's specific individuals, you know, like because in my Zen practice, I practice with people for decades. So literally, I know if I'm giving a Dharma talk, as I will, you know, I do at least once a week or more than once a week. I know literally the people, and I know their lives. But then beyond that, there's all the different people that I've practiced with, some of whom I've met once or twice, many of whom I talk to because private interview is part of Zen. So I really know, sort of in general, the kind of people who are coming to practice Zen or Jewish meditation and what their concerns are. So in other words, in those pieces of writing, I have a sense of who I'm addressing. I really have a sense. I feel almost like a sense of their being present with me in my solitude, in the solitude of writing. So that would be true of like a book like when you greet me, yes, when you greet me, I bow. It's true of that. It's also true of the world could be otherwise. But interestingly, as a kind of side note here, um, writing a talk that I'm going to give to people in person, even on Zoom, is different from writing a book. Because even though I'm thinking of the same audience, the form is different. So whenever I like my book, Training in Compassion, I wrote it because very devoted students made transcripts of the many, many talks that I gave on that text. But when I wrote the book, I could read those transcripts, but then I had to throw them away and start writing because it didn't work to make them into a book. The same with The World Could Be Otherwise. I gave many, many talks on the six paramitas, but I couldn't really use them directly for the writing because writing is different from writing for a written audience is different from writing for an audience that will hear me, my body and my mouth and my sound performing the words. So that's different. And then poetry, and all those texts I write on the computer. They're all written directly on the computer. I write poetry not on the computer, but in journals, in notebooks. So I have stacks and stacks of notebooks, and then I type, and typing the material is the first stage of revision. And then I revise from there on the computer. And there's a whole different feeling in my heart and in my mind when I'm writing longhand in a notebook. It's very, very intimate. And it's in my hand in a way that on the computer, it's not in my hand. Writing on the computer is a little bit more distant and a little more abstract to me. Writing longhand, I just feel literally every letter of every word as a gesture. And so sometimes it's very disappointing because the poem is profound in the notebook and loses almost all of its power in the transcription of it on the computer. Sometimes I throw away a lot of poems that are in my notebook. I love them, but they're so simple-minded and stupid that they just don't pass muster, you know, as a text that anybody would want to read. So that's very different. And in a certain way, there's a different rhythmical structure. Like I wrote nature in a notebook. Even though it's technically in prose, it's in my poetry mind. And so it didn't, so yes, there's sentences. And the thing that I like about writing poems in lines is I don't write in sentences. And I violate the convention of the sentence in the poetic line. There are people who write poems in sentences, use line, lineation, but also sentences. And the thing that I like about the line is that it violates the sentence, and I can have a syntax that doesn't depend on the syntax of a sentence. On the other hand, the syntax of a sentence is a brilliant thing, right? It's a brilliant human production. So the sentence is lovely. I love the sentence, but it's nice to like forget about the sentence in a poem. So all these modes are different, and that's part of the joy, right? Is enjoying all these different modes. And then the notebook is different. The journal entry is different, also a different form. So the Dharma talk is one form. The written Dharma book is another form. A poem has many different possible forms, and so on and so on. And so I enjoy exploring and writing in many different modes. And that, to me, it's like I'm never saying what I want to say. It's always, I feel everything. It's actually a little hard, you know, some days more than others, to recognize that everything that I have ever written has failed. It's too bad, you know. And it's hard to take sometimes, to think that you've wasted your entire life, right? All the time you've spent, you know, and it's totally a waste of time. Some days it's hard to take, but somehow or other, you know, hitting at it from so many different angles, you can have the hope that somehow like a little peep emerges somehow or other in between the lines, you know, having hit it from so many angles, maybe a little peep emerges. So that can sort of give you courage some days, you know. But yeah, so it's quite various. It's beautiful how various. I mean, language is just this one thing, but look how many ways. And no two voices in language are alike. You know, no two speech patterns, no two writing patterns are alike. Everybody finds their own voice one way or the other, and every voice is like a new language. It's quite unbelievable.
Thanks. That was such a beautiful answer. And you know, when you said at the end, like you feel like everything you've written has failed and you spent your whole life and you feel like, oh man, I've wasted my life. It reminds me of the end of this.
That's a Jewish person talking, yeah.
Exactly. But also, you know, the poet James Wright. Did you ever read any poetry by
A
James?
little bit, yeah.
Yeah, because he's got that famous poem "Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm," where he's lying in a hammock and looking at the trees and looking at a chicken hawk flying home, and he hears some bells on cows wandering home. And the last line is just, "I have wasted my life." The whole poem up to that is like description of what he's noticing around him. Well, there's so many things that I'd love to keep talking to you about. And I'm sure Molly would too, but we're just about out of time. So I wanted to see if you wanted to read a little bit, maybe a short poem on which to conclude.
Great, yeah. So here's from this book, I Was Blown Back, with a cover by my son Noah Fisher. And so I'll read you one. There's this the poem. Yeah, that's it. I Was Blown Back. Thank you for having it. And it's got two long series in the book, and and the first is a series of discrete poems without titles. And so I'll read you just one of them that I sort of just happened on. Because of the terror things are, because a corpse floats but a stone sinks and rests on the bottom, but a corpse is cast out, because the mind soars, sinks, wallows, wanders, because the heart aches, breaks, beats, swells with pride, because you can't see yourself in a mirror which eats your face, pulls your insides out, so that everything thinks they know you and casually pronounce your holy names. Because you think the night is dark and the light of day defines objects in your room, you pick up, grasp, and break. Because the cards you shuffled and arranged float out to form a picture, then scatter on a rolling lawn in front of a large house. When you arrive there, someone calls you by a second name and asks you to answer for all this.
That I love that poem. I was just rereading this book in the last week or so. So, Norman, thank you. This is just amazing getting a chance to spend this time together with you. I really, really am grateful for all your work and all the ways in which you help so many of us through your work. And Molly, I'll give you a chance to say something too here.
Yeah, thank you for everything in this hour, but that last poem really can't wait to buy the book and return to it. So yeah, just been a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you, and really nice to meet you, Molly, and see you again, Rick. Beautiful hour. Thank you. Went by very fast. Lots of fun. Thank you so much.